It's important to remember that Batman the Animated Series was, for all intents and purposes, a kids show that was intended to sell toys, t-shirts, and assortment of other pointless items of merchandise. But the creative team on the show didn't let that stop them from going to some pretty dark places. They should be commended for never talking down to their audience, and personally, I think that's part of the reason why the show has endured for so long. Despite their status as a flagship piece of children's entertainment, they gave us episodes about mental illness, betrayal, and how society tramples over certain people just because of who they are. There were also quite a few episodes that were absolutely horrifying, with scenes that were doubtlessly burned into the brains of the viewers. This time last year I talked about one such episode, Feet of Clay Part 1, and how every character's actions were motivated by fear, but apparently that was a bit too abstract for some people. So this year I'm going to talk about a more obvious horror episode, Moon of the Wolf. An episode that sees Batman taking on a literal werewolf. And I'm not going to be doing this alone. I've teamed up with Sasha from CasuallyComics to talk about this episode because it is a very faithful adaptation of a classic Batman comic book. Most of you are likely already familiar with Sasha and her work, but if you're not, she dedicates her time and energy to talking about comic books, not just Batman and comic book related media. So she's the ideal person to talk to about the comic book version of Moon of the Wolf. And in the spirit of collaboration, I'm going to adjust my usual format to appear on camera, as Sasha does. Do not adjust your television sets.
Moon of the Wolf story comes from a unique period in DC Comics history. The original tale is the lead story in Batman 255, which has a cover date of April 1974. 1974 was just 3 years after the first revision of the Comics Code, which was a self-imposed series of regulations across the comic book industry, officially beginning in 1954. Although there had been versions of it beforehand. This one was implemented as a preventative measure to avoid government regulation and oversight, because there was serious concerns about the impact the comics were having. There were even actual Senate hearings and everything. It was a real cultural panic. The 1971 code revision largely loosened the rules around supernatural creatures. This resulted in a boom of horror comics, particularly over at Marvel, who took big advantage of it with titles like Tomb of Dracula and Werewolf by Night. So a story like Moon of the Wolf is a result of such an environment. This story was written by Wein, who decades later penned the BTAS adaptation. The art was by Neal while the inks were by Dick Giordano. This story is the first of 2 substantial appearances by Tony Lupus. He is credited with 4 total, time of recording, so he didn't exactly light the world on fire. The comic opens with a woman being robbed by a werewolf, although both she and Batman think it must have been a man in a wolf costume, although Batman is very quick to entertain the idea of, but what if it is a werewolf? Although, I can see why they went for the costume theory. It's Gotham. That wouldn't be the strangest thing out there, not even in the top 20. This issue is a dual villain story, although as we'll see, Tony Lupus is more of a tragic figure. Our other antagonist is Professor Achilles Milo, a character born of the Silver Age. He debuted in Detective Comics 247 in 1957, created by Batman co-creator Bill Finger and Sheldon Moldoff. A former Olympic athlete, Lupus sought out Milo in a desperate search for a cure to his severe migraines. He had this chronic illness and pain, and it was just destroying his life. The cure he found worked, but it had a side effect, lycanthropy. But this only happened because Lupus, as it turned out, was a latent werewolf. That was part of what was happening to him. And so Milo, noticing this, brought that out in him. This so he could use him to kill Batman. So really everything happening here isn't Lupus's fault. He's been almost cursed by his genes. While this story is largely a setup, building up to getting to watch a Neal drawn Batman fight a werewolf, there is a deep tragedy to this story. Lupus has done nothing wrong. He's just a victim of manipulation and happenstance. He's been taken over by the secrets lurking in his own body. This comic doesn't delve too deeply into the complexities of the beast within, which it could do, especially because it's drawing such parallels to illness. However, it does play a bit in the realms of humans trying to control elements that they shouldn't. This in Milo's quest to tame and exploit Lupus. While overall it's a poetic and tense work, it's not one that greatly explores complex character motivations. Milo is seeking vengeance because of his past encounters with Batman, which, as you can imagine, went poorly. Batman is out to stop a werewolf because there's a werewolf on the loose, and Lupus, as mentioned, is just a victim of everything happening. There also isn't too much thought given to the existence of werewolves. They just are. That tends to be the way supernatural creatures are treated in this time period, though, and just throughout Batman's history. He's encountered them since dating back to his origins in the Golden Age. One of his early adventures was fighting a vampire, who was also a monk. But this comic does shift rather quickly from it's a man in a costume to, oh, it's just a werewolf. Adding in some investigative steps for Batman was a strength in the episode's retelling in the animated series. The episode also makes the decision to give Anthony a less sympathetic backstory by making him use Milo's serum as a performance enhancer rather than as a desperate cure for chronic pain. The choice drastically alters the tone of Anthony's character, and also the energy behind his battle with Batman. It must be said that the art in the comic issue is just stellar, and there are some truly captivating panels during the final Werewolf vs. Batman showdown. Issue 255 ends tragically for Lupus in that he is forced into isolation because of his condition, hiding out in Alaska hunting timber wolves, except for the time of month when he is among them. He would, as mentioned, reappear later on, but they don't really pull from that entry for the episode, so we'll leave that for another time.
So now that you know all about the comic book, let's talk about the episode itself. One of the first things that leaps out at me is that our antagonist has been renamed from Tony Lupus to Tony Romulus. This was likely done because they already had a character named Teddy Lupus, who appeared in Feet of Clay. They wanted to avoid repetition. Not that they're easy to confuse, mind you. I like the new surname for our werewolf though. Romulus is a mythological reference to the co-founder of Rome. He and his twin brother Remus were alleged to have been raised by wolves. I see what you did there, Wein, trying to educate us on the classics through a cartoon. One of the main problems I have with this episode though is the fact that lycanthropy, the act of changing into a werewolf, can be a rich metaphor depending on who's doing the changing. It can be a metaphor for puberty, see Teen Wolf, discovering your sexuality, see Ginger Snaps, or it can be about man's inherent predatory nature, see The Wolfman, Wolf, and about 1,000 other werewolf movies. But none of this really applies to Romulus. While the notion of the beast inside is touched upon, it is fairly underdeveloped. There's really only one scene that kind of touches on it, and that's when the werewolf savages Professor Milo, the one person that could cure his condition. By this point, the werewolf would rather get revenge on Milo, even if it means that Romulus will never be cured. Fortunately, due to the rules of the television networks at the time, Professor Milo survives the attack and can be seen being carted away by the GCPD at the end of the episode. Although given what happened to him later on in Justice League, it might have been better if Romulus had just finished him off. And that's the primary reason why this episode falls flat for me. Think about all of the rich metaphor in episodes like Feet of Clay and Baby Doll and so many others. This is just a tame monster story with unsympathetic characters. Tony Romulus, for instance, is an insecure cheater. He's an Olympic-level athlete and is ultra competitive. He is absolutely desperate to be seen as the best. But the reality is, he's second place at best. As a result of this, he has no qualms at all about cheating to get first place, showing he has no integrity at all. He goes to Professor Milo, a rubbish scientist with a stupid bowl cut. I really don't know why his haircut annoys me so, but it does. And Milo offers him an undetectable serum that will improve his performance. There are no intractable migraines here. Maybe he just drank some more water and took some ibuprofen. He's simply looking for a performance-enhancing drug. Romulus, rather stupidly, wolfs down the whole batch of the serum and begins to transform into the werewolf. Milo knew what the side effects of the serum would be, and now he could blackmail Romulus into doing his bidding. This sounds kind of similar to Roland Daggett's scheme to use Matt Hagen to impersonate his enemies, by getting him hooked on an addictive face cream that is used to restore his lost beauty. Seems like Milo was busy taking notes during his time working at Daggett Pharmaceuticals. And let's just note how much Romulus takes delight in deceiving Batman. Sure, he was forced to trap him by Milo, but he isn't complaining about it. Romulus is an insecure little cretin trying to prove his worth through acts of physicality, but no amount of muscle will make up for the empty void where his personality should be. Some parallels can also be drawn to the Man-Bat, whose first appearance in the episode On Leather Wings also featured a monster transformation scene that likely traumatized millions of children. Milo's serum is very clearly similar to the work of Kirk Langstrom, although it seems that the beast it creates retains the personality of the person it has emerged from, sort of, kind of, maybe? Frankly, it's all a little underdeveloped. While Kirk Langstrom describes the Man-Bat as a separate entity within himself, something that knows which chemicals it needs to bring itself to life, and how much he enjoys it, Romulus's werewolf does what Milo asks of it, which suggests that Romulus is in there somewhere and has some control. But he hates losing what little control he has and becoming a beast. If the werewolf was a separate entity, I have to think that it wouldn't want to do anything that could prevent it from existing. But again, they never really go too deeply into it, As an aside, the work of Milo, Langstrom and Emil Dorian would go on to inspire the Splicers during the Batman Beyond era, as I discussed in my recent video about Splicers, so check that out if the subject interests you. Now, as for the werewolf transformations, I thought they were a bit underwhelming. I get a sense that while there are people that are very vocal about the horror of the transformation scenes in On Leather Wings and Feet of Clay, for instance, fewer people talk about Moon of the Wolf. Maybe if the animation had been better, then we might have people talking about being traumatized by this episode. Instead, I think most are distracted by some weird animation errors. And it's not just my opinion that this episode has problems. Bruce Timm included it in a list of DCAU episodes that he has issued an apology for, along with Prophecy of Doom, Superman's Pal, The Terrible Trio, I've Got Batman in My Basement, Cat Scratch Fever, Heavy Metal, and Animal Act. That seemed a bit harsh because I don't think that this episode is entirely without merit. For instance, I'm quite partial to the electric guitar score. It may not be to everyone's taste, but this is a rare example of a rock soundtrack in BTAS. And I do find myself humming the Werewolf's tune every now and then. Additionally, I like the message of the episode that cheaters never prosper. While Romulus had used the formula to win races and get lucrative sponsorship deals, by the end of the episode, he's lost it all, as his palatial mansion and all of his possessions are sold off. He wanted to be the best of the best, rather than one of the best. Sure, he was successful in the short term, but his insecurities cost him everything.
While Romulus's Wolfman doesn't appear in another episode of the animated series, he would return off-screen in the pages of the tie-in comic, paying off the idea that is seated in the episode that he was still out there. This occurred in the Batman Adventures 21 in the story House of Dorian, cover date June 1994. This was written by Kelly Puckett and Michael Reeves, with art by Mike Parabeck, inks Fritz Burchett, and colors Rick Taylor. This one is a bit of a creature feature. You're getting more than just a werewolf here. You also get Man-Bat and Tigress. Story-wise, this is much more of a sequel to Tiger Tiger than Moon of the Wolf. Yes, it does follow up Moon of the Wolf, but most of the character work is happening with Tigress. The main villain is Emil Dorian, seeking to continue his experiments and punish those who put a stop to them, Batman and Catwoman. This is why he mutates and takes control of Kirk Langstrom, Man-Bat. Romulus wanders into this scenario because he's seeking a cure for his lycanthropy. However, there's more time, as mentioned, given to Tigress and his struggles to choose to walk his own path or the one dictated by his quote-unquote father. All of this devolves into a potential body swap scenario between Batman and Tigress against Batman's consent. It's always an awkward day for a body swap in the DCAU. Looking at you, Rage. Romulus is not cured in this issue and instead ends up in a huge fight with Man-Bat and Tigress, in which they all appear to die. No love for Romulus here either. As mentioned, not only is Romulus as a character not the most memorable, but the episode he features in was also not the best received. Part of that, on top of the issues already mentioned, may be due to the overtly supernatural tone. Outings like On Leather Wings and Tiger Tiger feel a bit more in the realm of sci-fi, although of course there has always been some overlap between the two genres, but they feel more distinct time of recording, and as time has gone on in literary culture, they more split off. So in a way, a werewolf feels quite different from a science experiment gone wrong. Now, while this episode does have Milo and the mad scientist element, the fact that there is a werewolf reads as more supernatural. Even though one could argue that he's not a true werewolf, he's more a pseudo-werewolf, but even still, that association is there in the minds of most viewers. And for some, that can come across as jarring in comparison to the rest of the series, which is more grounded in quotes, in the sense that has clear, realistic rules within its own universe. Having an episode like Moon of the Wolf can as a result feel like it comes a bit out of left field. However, as mentioned, Batman has a long history with the supernatural and just encountering it. That comic with the Mad Monk, the vampire who he follows all the way to Hungary, that's from the Golden Age, and his first encounter with the Mad Monk was in Detective Comics 31 in 1939. So Batman comes across stumbling into the supernatural quite honestly. In spite of this, overall, that is not what Batman is known for. It is not the way his character has moved over time. It's not what one tends to think of when one thinks of the Dark Knight. And when one examines Batman TAS as its own entity, this episode does stand out. Although Bruce Timm apologizing for it does feel a tad dramatic. While it may not have been the most riveting episode, it is interesting to compare and contrast it to its comic source. In many ways, the changes made in the episode do strengthen the concept by adding some more characterization to the antagonists, and framing it inside of a more classic morality playstyle structure. However, unlike its comic counterpart, the episode fails to deliver on the Batman-werewolf fight. And when you hear Batman is gonna fight a werewolf, you want it to be epic.
Like Sasha says, ultimately, Moon of the Wolf is a fairly forgettable episode that doesn't live up to the potential of Batman versus a werewolf. And not just because of the broadcast standards and practices of the time. It has very little of the symbolism and pathos seen in other BTAS monster episodes, and is really let down by some wonky animation. It does get some bonus points for being an adaptation of a classic Len Wein and Neal Adams Batman comic book, but your mileage on that may vary.
If you want some more supernatural Batman action that has a bit more substance to it, the Gene Colan Batman era has some really solid stories. There is also, of course, the Elseworlds tale making up the Batman and Dracula trilogy, which have some truly stellar and unsettling art, which starts with Red Rain. Batman tends to be more associated with vampirism than lycanthropy most of the time. The association is just easier to make because he's got a bat theme, he's got the whole Dark Knight moniker, he's skulking in the shadows. For many, it's just simply an easier connection to make, but that doesn't mean people have given up or lost interest in the idea of Batman encountering werewolves, or more specifically, fighting one. Time of recording in 2024, in this spooky October month, DC Comics launched a Black Label miniseries called Batman Full Moon. This will of course feature Batman fighting a werewolf. Let them fight. So clearly this episode didn't dim any enthusiasm for the concept long term, but all of those are just our thoughts. Are you a fan of this episode? Are you a Moon of the Wolf defender? Leave your thoughts down below. I want to hear all of them. Thanks so much for taking some time. Bye-bye.
Okay, that's it for this Halloween special, and this is the last video in my Spooky Month series. I hope you have enjoyed it. Special thanks to Sasha from CasuallyComics for joining me in this lovely discussion of Moon of the Wolf. She and I recently did a live stream where we talked about the Batman ahead of its 20th anniversary. Make sure you check that out if you have enjoyed this video, and hey, consider subscribing to her channel. If you have enjoyed this video, don't forget to click the like button. You could share the video, leave a comment, or hell, even use the bell button if you're that way inclined. That way, you will never miss one of my future videos. I offer channel memberships for $1.99 per month. This will get you early access to all of my video essays, as well as a bunch of other supplemental perks, like getting your name displayed on screen here, like these generous folks right now. Next time, I'm going to talk about the winner of my Superman the Animated Series villain poll. The most evil being in the entire universe, Darkseid, and how the version seen in the DC animated universe is arguably their most faithful adaptation of any character. Hope to see you then.